All right, so let's dive into this one. This is pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
You requested a deep dive into, well, I guess you could say a dark chapter in U.S. history.
Yeah.
The government experimenting on civilians. And wow, the sources you sent, really chilling stuff.
Yeah. You know what's fascinating to me is the context. We're talking Cold War. Real peak Cold War paranoia,
But
intense fear of the Soviets getting ahead, particularly in mind control. And the U.S. was determined to stay ahead of the curve, but that led to some pretty questionable decisions.
decisions, yeah, it's putting it lightly.
Yeah.
The program we're going to be looking at today is MKultra.
Right.
And it really is kind of like a real-life spy thriller, but like way darker.
Yeah, for sure. And Cultural was basically, it was the CIA's big foray into mind control. They were afraid, I mean, genuinely afraid, that the Soviets were already using these techniques into, on American prisoners of war and stuff. And the program itself, I mean, it was totally shrouded in secrecy, right? It went on for decades. It had over 150 sub-projects. I mean, it was really a massive undertaking.
And one of those sub-projects, the one you specifically asked about, is Operation Midnight Climax.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really, really disturbing. So picture it. San Francisco, 1950s. The CIA sets up this safe house, right? Disguised as a brothel. They got two-way mirrors, recording equipment, the whole 9 yards.
And their goal, as we can tell from declassified documents, the ones that have been released, and the personal diaries of George Hunter White, the agent who was in charge, the goal was to study the effects of LSD on unsuspecting men.
Wow.
White himself he was a former journalist, actually. He became a federal agent, and he was known for his, well, let's just say aggressive tactics and his complete and total dedication to the mission.
So these weren't like willing participants, signing up for some scientific study.
No, no.
This is the CIA hiring prostitutes to lure men into this fake brothel,
Yep.
slipping LSD into their drinks, and then just watching what happens.
Exactly. And White's diaries are really something. I mean, they're really revealing. They give you a glimpse into the mindset of the people who are running this thing. He talks about, wanting to have total control over another person, even going against their will, their basic instincts, everything.
Yeah.
It's really disturbing. The complete lack of consent, the manipulation. I mean, it's really unsettling.
And it goes beyond just, drugging them. It's like, it's a systematic attempt to break down a person's entire personality.
Right.
And like rebuild it the way they want.
Exactly. And the thing is, Operation Midnight Climax, this wasn't just some isolated incident. It was part of a bigger pattern. This whole thing with experimentation, I think it was fueled by, all the anxiety of the Cold War and this belief that mind control was like the next big thing in warfare.
It's wild.
So, we talked about Operation Midnight Climax, how they were using LSD, but there are other M-Culture projects going on that were exploring different ways to try to, control minds, some of them even more disturbing. Like, for example, there was this guy, Dr. Ewan Cameron.
Oh, yeah.
He was up in Canada at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal.
This is where things get even darker. What was happening in Canada? And how was the U.S. involved?
Well, the CIA was actually funding Dr. Cameron's research. And he was working on this technique he called psychic driving, which sounds pretty creepy right off the bat.
Yeah, what is psychic driving?
Basically, he would use a combination of things, like intensive electroshock therapy, drug-induced comas, and he would force patients to listen to these repetitive messages over and over again. And the idea was to basically wipe out their personality, like completely erase it and then reprogram their minds.
Okay, hold on. So they're trying to like wipe someone's mind clean and create like a brand new personality.
That was the theory, yeah. Cameron, he believed that by breaking down a person's existing thoughts and behaviors, he could rebuild them from scratch and, in theory, cure mental illnesses like schizophrenia.
It's insane.
Yeah, his methods were brutal, man. Really brutal. And the patients, the consequences were devastating for a lot of them.
The sources you sent, some of them detail the accounts of the patients who went through this psychic driving, and they are just heartbreaking. What was the long-term impact on these people?
Well, a lot of Cameron's patients suffered some really serious psychological damage, and it was lasting. I mean, some people lost their memories, their sense of identity. They couldn't even function on their own.
Right.
They were just completely lost. Emotional distress, confusion, this profound sense of loss. And it wasn't temporary. For a lot of these people, the damage was irreversible.
I mean, how could any doctor, any medical professional
No.
do that to their patients? Did Cameron ever face any consequences for this?
his work did eventually come under scrutiny. And they found out about the CIA's involvement, which obviously caused a huge scandal.
Right.
But, the full extent of the damage didn't really come out until much later. And a lot of the victims and their families, they had to fight really hard for compensation, just to get recognition for the harm that was done to them.
It's unbelievable. So we've got the CIA running brothels, dosing people with LSD in San Francisco. They're funding experiments in Canada that are basically mind-wiping people. What else was happening during this time?
It's crazy, right? And unfortunately, these are just two examples. I mean, M culture was huge, all kinds of experiments, sensory deprivation, hypnosis. They even used electromagnetic radiation.
No way.
The scope of the program was massive, and the legacy, well, it's still haunting us.
It's like something out of like a dystopian novel or something. It's hard to believe this actually happened, in the real world, with the U.S. government behind it all.
It really is, and it makes you think, right, about what can happen when the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of power goes unchecked, especially in times of fear and uncertainty, which the Cold War definitely was. I mean, the Cold War created this climate where ethical boundaries were just blurred. And this idea of national security, it was used to justify some truly horrific actions.
So this deep dive, definitely eye-opening. And we haven't even talked about the experiments where they deliberately expose soldiers and civilians to radiation, chemical, and biological agents.
Oh, yeah, we've got a lot more to unpack.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's important. It's important to remember this stuff, Acknowledge these dark chapters in our history. I mean, that's the only way we can understand how power can be abused and why it's so important to protect people's basic human rights.
Absolutely. Before we go into those other disturbing experiments, I think it's worth taking a minute to think about what all this means, on a bigger scale.
Yeah.
What does this tell us about the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of ethics in scientific research?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around that this stuff was happening in the name of national security.
Yeah.
With no regard for the people involved.
Right. It really makes you question, how do we balance scientific progress and national security with basic human rights? Like, where do we draw the line?
That's the big question. And speaking of lines, what happened after all this came out? You sent over some articles about the aftermath of MKUltra, and it sounds like, well, eventually it got investigated, but did anyone actually face any consequences?
So it was the 1970s when the public first found out about MKUltra. It was a New York Times article that really blew it open, and then Congress started investigating. And of course, there was a lot of public outrage, rightfully so.
Yeah. And it did lead to some reforms, which is good. But here's the catch. The CIA, they destroyed a ton of the program's records.
Oh, wow. So there's still so much we don't know.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of details about MKUltra are still classified, and a lot of victims never got justice or even any acknowledgement, what they went through. So it kind of makes you wonder how effective oversight really is.
Yeah.
And how do you hold these powerful institutions accountable?
Yeah. It's a reminder that even in a democracy, we can't just assume our freedoms are safe. We have to be proactive.
Right.
About protecting our rights, especially when national security is being used to justify keeping things secret or doing things that are, questionable.
It's a slippery slope for sure. And here's the thing that really gets me. MKUltra, yeah, it was a product of the Cold War, but the ethical questions it raises, they're still relevant today. We're dealing with new technologies all the time, stuff that could be used for manipulation or control.
Oh, absolutely. Think about AI, all the data that's being collected. Surveillance technologies are getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, we need to be having open discussions about the ethics of all this stuff and making sure there are safeguards in place.
Absolutely. We can't just repeat the mistakes of the past. We have to learn from them. And that means demanding transparency from our governments, making sure scientific research is being conducted ethically, and holding people in power accountable.
So what can people do? Practically speaking, how can our listeners make sure these lessons aren't forgotten and that these issues stay on the radar?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Engage in critical thinking. Don't just take things at face value. Question authority. Question the stories that are being told, especially by people in power.
Yeah.
And support organizations that are fighting for transparency, accountability, and human rights.
That's great advice. Well, this deep dive has been a lot. I mean, it's heavy stuff, but definitely important. Operation Midnight Climax, MKUltra. It's all just a really scary example of what can happen when power goes unchecked and the human cost, when national security is put ahead of individual rights.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway here is that knowledge is power. The more we learn about this stuff, the better equipped we are to prevent it from happening again.
Totally agree. To our listeners, thanks for sending this in. This was a deep dive for sure. Keep researching, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going. This stuff matters. And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay engaged.